Only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you end up liking this video, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always unsubscribe. Enjoy the video.
We were gods, we ruled the stars, and in our blind perfection, we handcrafted the very god that would devour our souls forever.
The Fall of the Eldari. Part 1. The Age of Perfection. In the dawn of the galaxy, long before the primitive footsteps of mankind echoed on a single, lonely world, there were the Eldari. The Eldar. For uncounted millennia, they had known nothing but absolute mastery over the stars. Their reign was as long as the memory of the cosmos itself. Their power was as profound as the void between worlds. Their cities, delicate as spun glass, reached into the heavens. Their shapes were impossible for any other mind to conceive, let alone copy. Their beauty was not just undeniable. It was a physical force, a statement of their dominance over the very laws of aesthetics. Everywhere there was light. A soft, warm, and constant luminescence bathed their worlds in a peaceful, perpetual glow. The Eldari had no need for darkness. They had long since conquered it, banished it from their hearts and their heavens. Their technology was not the crude, mechanical clockwork that humans or orcs would later hammer into existence. No, their technology was alive. It was psionic, organic, pulsing with a gentle, psychic hum that resonated in harmony with its masters. Even their starships, their great void whales of the Empyrean, were living things. They were sculpted from wraithbone, a psychoplastic material pulled straight from the raw energy of the warp itself. Each craft moved in silence, a predator of elegance, slipping between the folds of space rather than crudely cutting through it. Planets that other, lesser species would struggle to colonize, the Eldari had turned into paradise gardens. These Edens stretched as far as the eye could see, the very air perfumed with flowers that never wilted. There were no bellowing factories, no polluted skies, no fields tilled by manual labor. Everything simply worked because the Eldari had willed it to be so. If there were any problems in this vast empire, they were invisible. The civilization had solved every conceivable challenge. No one wanted for anything. Hunger, disease, poverty, war, these were archaic concepts studied only by historians. Life for the Eldari was about creation. It was about art. It was about experiencing every conceivable facet of existence. Each Eldari pursued a craft, whether it was song, the sculpting of light, or something stranger. They lived for millennia, immune to the ravages of age. If they tired of one pursuit, they would simply begin another. And so they grew inward. There were no more wars to fight, no real enemies to speak of. The galaxy was theirs. Their warriors had laid down their arms long ago. Their fleets sailed the stars not for battle, but for beauty, for simple, idle curiosity. It was in this age of absolute perfection, this time of profound stillness, that the rot began. Perfection, it seemed, was a prison of its own design. Their minds, restless and brilliant, had achieved all there was to achieve. And it was not enough. They needed new experiences, new sensations. Some began to look inward, searching for new heights of pleasure, of feeling. And what they found there, in the unexplored dark, changed them. At first, it was harmless. A few Eldari, bored with perfection, sought out new ways to feel. They pushed their potent psychic powers not toward creation, but toward pure, unadulterated sensation. A small cult here, a private gathering there. But as time passed, as centuries dripped by, it grew. Pleasure became obsession. Obsession became devotion. Entire worlds turned their collective will to the singular pursuit of excess. Eldari minds, once the most disciplined in the galaxy, began to bend. What had been a slow drift toward hedonism became a torrent, a plunge into a bottomless abyss. There were warnings, whispers, spoken by the few who still had the clarity to see. The farsers, those who peered into the tangled futures of the warp. spoke of shadows moving in the immaterium. They spoke of a dark presence, a non-entity, growing stronger, coalescing in the psychic sea, fed by the very emotions their race was now pouring into it. But their words were ignored. What threat could there be? They were the Eldari. They had mastered the warp itself. They believed, untouchable. Or so they believed. Part 2. The Sensation Cults. Kayla Thurn stood on the balcony, overlooking the sprawling city of Shaddam. The evening light bathed the impossible towers in a golden, rose-hued glow. It was a view he had seen countless times, a view that had once filled his soul with peace and pride. Tonight, it felt different. The city, with its graceful arches and delicate, miles-high spires, felt distant, alien. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. It was a subtle sensation, a dissonance at the very edge of his mind. He noticed it growing over the years, a creeping malaise. But lately, it had become harder to ignore. The gatherings, the parties, the endless, frantic indulgence. It had all started to feel hollow. A soft chime, like shattered crystal, broke his thoughts. He turned. A figure was stepping through the arched doorway. Navara. She moved with a silken, predatory flow, her long, dark robes like liquid shadow. Her eyes fixed on him with a knowing, almost pitying smile. "You've been avoiding me, Caliph." Her voice was low and smooth. "I was starting to think you'd grown tired of us." Caliph smiled faintly, a mask that didn't touch his eyes. He turned back to the view. "I needed time to think," he said. "And what is it that troubles you, old friend?" She asked, her tone light, teasing. "The world is at your feet, as it always has been. What more could you possibly want?" He hesitated. How could he explain it? It wasn't simple boredom. It was an emptiness, a void. The same indulgences, the same psychic highs, now left him feeling cold. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just feel detached." Navara's smile widened, a slow, predatory curving of her perfect lips. "Then you have truly come to the right place," she said. "We've all felt it, Caliph. That need, that hunger for something more. It's why we started the gatherings in the first place." She moved to his side. "You've only scratched the surface of what's possible." Caliph glanced at her, intrigued despite himself. The gatherings. It had been years since he truly participated. He remembered the early days, when the sensations were overwhelming, but even that, in time, had grown stale. "What do you mean?" he asked. Navara's dark eyes gleamed. "There are deeper paths to explore, Caliph," she said. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm, sending a jolt through him that was part pleasure, part alarm. "Come to the gathering tonight. Let me show you." He hesitated. The unease, the whisper of wrongness, was screaming at him. But the truth was, he was curious. He was bored. He still wanted to feel. "All right," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I'll come." The hall was filled with a soft, pulsing light. Eldari lounged on cushions of spun silk, their minds already drifting. The air was thick, cloying, with the scent of exotic flowers and rare incense. But beneath it all was something else, something metallic like ozone or spilled blood. Caliph entered slowly, his gaze sweeping over the familiar faces. Nobles, scholars, artists, those who had always sought more. Navara was waiting for him at the center, her smile welcoming, but her eyes held a new sharpness. A hunger. "Close your eyes," she whispered, her voice soothing, yet commanding. "Let yourself go." Caliph obeyed. The psychic connection formed almost immediately, like slipping into a warm, familiar pool. He could feel the others, their minds touching his, their emotions bleeding into his own. The boundaries between them dissolved. Pleasure flowed through the connection, a shared warmth that enveloped them all. But then, slowly it began to shift. The warmth turned to heat. The pleasure became something sharper, more intense, bordering on pain. Caliph's breath quickened. It was exhilarating. It was terrifying, and he couldn't pull away. Then, in the middle of it all, he felt it, a presence. It was subtle at first, a shadow at the very edge of his consciousness. A cold spot in the warmth of the link. But it was there, and it was growing stronger. It didn't belong to any of them. It was something other. Calith's eyes snapped open. The connection broke. He stumbled back, gasping for breath. The others remained lost in the psychic current, their faces masks of serene ecstasy. Only Navarra stood, watching him, her expression unreadable. "You felt it," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Calith nodded, his mouth dry. What was that?" Navarra smiled, but there was no warmth in it this time. "It's what we've been searching for, Calith. The thing that's been waiting for us all this time." Her eyes unfocused. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" He shook his head, the unease growing into a cold knot of fear. "That wasn't beautiful, Navarra. That was something dark." Her eyes flashed. "You don't understand yet," she whispered. "But you will. We're on the verge of something incredible, Calith. Something beyond anything we've ever known." Calith backed away, his mind racing. He didn't know what he had felt, but it was wrong. It felt hungry. I need to go," he muttered, turning toward the exit. Navarra didn't try to stop him. She simply watched, her smile widening. "You can't run from this, Calith," she called after him, her voice echoing in the silent hall. "It's already begun." The night air was cool against his skin, but it did nothing to calm the turmoil inside him. The city stretched out before him, but the lights seemed dimmer now, as if the darkness was pressing in. He looked up at the stars, their cold, ancient light flickering. For the first in his long, perfect life, Calithern felt truly afraid. Part 3. The First Exodus. Far from the decadent, blinding sprawl of the core worlds, the great craft worlds moved silently through the cold void. They had been drifting for centuries, their continent-sized, wraithbone hulls glowing faintly against the blackness. Inside, they were alive. The collective psychic energy of the Farseers and the spirits of their dead, housed in the infinity circuits, coursed through the ships like blood. These were not ships of pleasure. They were arcs. They were prophecies given form. Farseer Melanos stood in the dome of crystal seers on the craft world Ulthui. He had seen this future long ago, before the first craft world even left the Empire's grasp. He knew what was coming. The visions had been too clear. The heart of the Eldari Empire would fall, consumed by something dark and terrible. Something born of their own indulgence, their own arrogance, their own souls. Slaanesh. The name was still little more than a whisper in the warp, a psychic blasphemy. But it was growing louder with each passing year, with every depraved ritual performed in the core worlds. And yet, despite the warnings, most of them had stayed. They remained lost in their hedonistic pursuits, convinced that they were untouchable. But Melanos knew better. They're still not listening, are they? A voice, soft as starlight, spoke behind him. Melanos didn't turn. He knew the voice. Liran, one of the younger seers. "No," he replied quietly. "They haven't listened in centuries, Liran. Why would they start now?" Liran sighed. "I thought maybe this time, with the visions growing stronger." "It doesn't matter," Melanos interrupted, his voice heavy with resignation. "They have grown too arrogant, too blind. They cannot see what is coming because they do not want to." A silence stretched between them, the psychic hum of the craft world the only sound. "We need more time," Liran said finally. "There's still many more out there, those who haven't yet fallen. If we could just reach them." Melanos shook his head slowly. "We have tried, Liran, and we will keep trying, but we cannot stay here much longer. The longer we wait, the more we risk losing everything." Just then, a third figure approached, his movements sharp, urgent. Corin, another of the seers. "Melanos." Corin nodded briefly to Liran. "There's been a disturbance in the warp. A significant one." Melanos felt a cold chill creep up his spine, though he kept his face an impassive mask. "Show me." In the center of the seer's chamber, a pool of shimmering, psychic light rippled with energy. A scrying glass, allowing them to look into the roiling currents of the immaterium. "We detected the disturbance just before sunrise," Korn explained. "It's growing stronger, faster than before." Melanos stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the portal. Reaching out with his thoughts, he let the psychic energy wash over him. At first, it was calm. But beneath that surface, there was something darker, something vast and terrible and hungry. The visions came quickly, more violent than before. He saw flashes of the future, worlds burning, Eldari cities, those beautiful, impossible structures reduced to ash, their people consumed, and at the center of it all, a shadow, a figure, something beautiful and horrifying all at once, something that radiated power and desire and consumption. Slaanesh. The name echoed through his mind. It wasn't fully formed yet, not entirely, but it was close, too close. Melanos pulled back from the vision with a sharp, gasping intake of breath. The room was silent, all eyes on him. "It's worse than we thought," he said quietly. "It's coming, faster than we predicted. We don't have much time." Liran's eyes widened. "But we've only just begun preparations. There's still so many. We can't save them all, Liran." Melanos cut her off, his voice firm now, the voice of a leader. "The best we can do is save those who will listen. The craft worlds are ready. We need to leave. Now." There was a heavy, suffocating silence in the room. "We will send out one final message," Melanos continued, his tone resolute. "A psychic scream to any who will listen. But after that, we leave. We commit our futures to the void." The message went out, a desperate, psychic signal cast across the stars. It carried the warnings, the visions of the coming doom. A final, desperate plea. But even as the message spread, Melanos knew. Most would not respond. Most would ignore it, just as they had ignored all the warnings before. Days passed, and slowly, ships began to arrive. Not many, just a few here and there. They carried Eldari who had grown tired of the indulgence, who had sensed the wrongness. Those who, at the last possible moment, had chosen to listen. They were the ones who still valued discipline and tradition and restraint. They were not enough. Not nearly enough. Melanos stood on the landing platform as the last small, elegant solar sailor touched down. He watched them in silence, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was all that remained. This was all that could be saved. The rest were lost. "It's time," Liran said softly from beside him, her voice thick with unshed tears. Melanos nodded. "Begin the departure sequence." The craft world stirred to life. The hum of psychic energy grew stronger, a thrumming vibration that sang through the Wraithbone Hull. One by one, the great ships, arcs of a dying race, prepared to leave. They lifted off, their massive hulls glowing faintly as they moved toward the blackness, away from the heart of their doomed empire. Melanos turned away, his thoughts dark. This was not a victory. It was an escape, a route, and even then, he wasn't sure if it would be enough. As the craft worlds drifted into the blackness of space, the shadow of Slaanesh loomed ever closer, and Melanos knew, with a terrible, cold certainty, that no matter how far they ran, the darkness would follow. The first exodus had begun, but the fall of the Eldari was far from over. Part 4, The Hunger. Caliph returned to the gatherings. He returned with a weariness that hadn't been there before, a hollowness in his core. The night he had felt that thing in the psychic link had unsettled him to his very soul. He had felt something cold and ancient, lurking just beneath the surface. It was as if the currents of pleasure they all shared were not just dissipating, but were being channeled, that they were feeding a presence. But no one else seemed to notice. Or if they did, no one else seemed to care. And yet, despite his unease, despite the screaming wrongness of it all, Caliph couldn't stay away. The lure was too strong. It was an addiction. The psychic link that tied them together was intoxicating, and he found himself craving it more and more. Tonight, the hall was filled with a deeper, darker energy. The familiar faces were there, but there was something new, something sharper in the air. The soft, pulsing light flickered strangely, casting long, distorted shadows. Navarra stood at the center, as she always did. The others were already forming the circle around her, weaving the threads of the psychic link. For a moment, he hesitated. The memory of that cold, hungry presence was still vivid. But then Navarra turned to him. Her eyes met his, and the hesitation melted away. She smiled. That same, knowing, irresistible smile. "Come, Caliph," she said, her voice smooth and warm, yet with an edge he hadn't heard before. "You're just in time." He stepped forward, drawn to her by something he no longer wanted to explain. He could feel their thoughts, their emotions mingling with his own. It was familiar, comforting, and yet something was different. As the link deepened, Caliph felt the usual rush of pleasure. But underneath it, there was an intensity, a hunger. It hadn't been there before. Not like this. As the link grew stronger, so did the hunger. He could feel it pulling at him, drawing him deeper into the storm of emotions. The others were lost in it, their minds completely open. But Caliph could feel something else there with them, something that didn't belong. It was the same presence he had felt that night, the same cold, ancient other force, but it was stronger now, more insistent. It was as if the rituals, the excesses were feeding it, giving it shape, giving it power, and it was watching them, waiting. His breath quickened as the hunger pressed down on him, suffocating. He tried to pull back to break the link, but it held him fast. He could feel himself slipping, losing control. "Caliph!" Navarra's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear. He opened his eyes, gasping. He found her standing before him, her eyes seeming to burn with a dark, internal light. "You're holding back." He started, his voice shaking. She held up a hand, silencing him. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked, stepping closer, her voice low and hypnotic. "You felt it for a long time now. That presence, that power. It's what we've been searching for, all of us." Caliph shook his head. This isn't what I wanted, Navarra. This isn't right." She smiled, but again there was no warmth in it. "You don't understand. Not yet, but you will. You're still clinging to the old ways, to the rules that no longer apply. We've moved beyond them, Caliph. We found something greater." "You're afraid," she said softly, "because you don't understand. But once you let go, once you embrace it, you'll see. You'll feel it." Caliph's heart pounded. The presence was still there, at the edges of his mind. Hungry, waiting. He wanted to run, but he couldn't. The pull was too strong. "Join me," Navarra whispered, her hand reaching out to him. "Let go of your fear, Caliph. Embrace what we are becoming." For a moment, he stood frozen, torn, and then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand. The next few nights, or were they weeks, months, passed in a blur of sensation. The gatherings grew darker, more intense. It was as if the presence that lingered among them had taken hold, guiding them down a path they no longer controlled. The pleasure they once sought now became something sharper, something far closer to pain, and then something beyond both. Caliph found himself swept up in it. His mind, his will was lost in the storm. The rituals became darker, more twisted, and the presence watched, always watching, its hunger growing with every offering they made. Caliph could feel it now, a constant companion. It whispered to him in the darkness, promising him power, promising him ecstasy. And yet, beneath the promises, there was something else. He saw it in the others. Their eyes were hollow, their faces gaunt. Their minds were no longer their own. They had given themselves to the presence completely, and it had consumed them, piece by piece. Caliph knew that if he stayed, it would consume him too. But still, he couldn't leave. There was no escape now. The presence had already taken root in his soul. One night, as the gathering reached a fevered, frantic peak, Caliph felt the presence more strongly than ever before. It pressed down on him, suffocating, overwhelming. And he knew, in that moment, that there was no turning back. He had already embraced his own damnation, and there was no escape. Navarra watched him from across the room, her eyes gleaming with a cold, terrifying satisfaction. She could see it in him, the surrender, the acceptance. He was one of them now, truly one of them. "Welcome," she whispered, her voice carrying through the storm of sensation. "Welcome to the future, Caliph." And as the darkness closed in around him, he felt the presence smile. Part 5, The Fall. The Farseers had seen it all coming, but their warnings had fallen on deaf ears. In the ancient, quiet halls of the craft world Ulfwi, Farseer Melanos sat at the head of a circle of seers. His face was a mask of concentration, his eyes closed as his mind wandered the dark and bloody paths of the future. The visions had been growing more frequent, more vivid, and more terrifying. Liran, standing at his side, shifted uncomfortably. She could sense the turmoil swirling in the warp, the psychic currents darker, more violent than they had ever been. At last, Melanos opened his eyes. His gaze was heavy, haunted by the weight of what he had seen. "The fall is nearly upon us," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, yet it echoed with the finality of doom. Slaanesh is almost awake. A psychic shudder spread through the room. They had all seen it in their own visions. The terrible, beautiful, obscene entity stirring in the warp, growing stronger with every passing moment. It fed on the excesses of their people. It fed on the raw, unfiltered emotions that radiated from the core worlds like a psychic beacon. They had tried to stop it. They had tried to warn their people. But their cries had been ignored, drowned out by the endless sounds of pleasure. "How much time do we have?" Liran asked, her voice quiet but steady. Melanos hesitated. "Not long. A few months, perhaps. Maybe less." The time for vague, distant predictions was over. It was happening. Now, one of the younger seers, Tindra, leaned forward, her face pale. "We need to warn them again. Send out another message." "They won't listen," Melanos interrupted, his tone sharp. "They haven't listened in centuries. They are too far gone." Liran nodded slowly, a deep sadness in her eyes. She had seen it herself, the madness that had taken root in the heart of their empire. The rituals that had once been sacred had become twisted, dark. Worse than the destruction of their cities was the destruction of their souls. The presence of Slaanesh could be felt everywhere in the warp. The god was feeding on them, growing fat on their indulgence. And they didn't even realize it. Or worse, they did, and they welcomed it. "We will send one final message," Melanos said at last, his tone resigned. "But I do not expect it to change anything." "What about the craft worlds?" Liran asked. Melanos glanced out at the stars. The craft worlds were their last hope. The massive, world-sized ships had been built in secret, designed as sanctuaries, as arks. Many Farsurs, and those few who had heeded their warnings, had already fled to them. But they were not enough. The vast majority of their people, billions upon billions, remained in the core worlds, oblivious. "The craft world are ready," Melanos said quietly. "But most of our people will not survive what is coming." Liran's hand tightened into a fist. "Then we leave. Soon. We can't wait for the rest of them. The longer we stay, the closer we are to destruction." "Wait," Melanos called after her. "Before you go, you should all see what is happening." Now, he turned back to the shimmering, scrying pool in the center of the room. The seers gathered, forming a tight circle. Melanos reached out with his mind, his will touching the surface of the warp. The others followed his lead. Their minds joined his, weaving together. And then the visions came. At first, it was a familiar sight. The great, beautiful cities of the Eldari Empire. But the beauty was short-lived. The buildings began to crumble. A creeping, psychic darkness crept in from the edges. The skies darkened. The stars, one by one, flickered and died until there was only the void. And in the center of it all, a figure emerged. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were blurred, indistinct. But the power that radiated from it was unmistakable. It was a force of pure, undiluted hunger, of desire, and it reached out with tendrils of darkness, consuming everything in its path. Slaanesh. The name echoed through their minds, a psychic scream. The seers recoiled, their psychic links shattering as the vision faded. The room fell into an uneasy, terrified silence. "There is no stopping it," Melanos said quietly, his voice filled with a profound, bottomless sorrow. "Slaanesh will be born, and when it happens, the Empire will fall." There was no more time. They had to leave. "We send the message," Liran said, her voice steady, despite the dread that filled her. "And then we go." And as the craft worlds began their final preparations for their long, lonely journey, the darkness in the warp continued to grow. The birth of a god was drawing ever closer. Part 6, the scream. Caliph had begun to lose track of the days. The gatherings now seemed endless, each one bleeding into the next. He had long since surrendered to the currents, to the psychic energies, and to the presence. It was always there now, in every thought, in every breath. At first, it had been a faint whisper, a cool hand brushing against his soul. But now it was unmistakable, strong, commanding, insatiable. It had grown. It had fed on their excess, on their indulgence. And still, they continued. Despite the palpable sense of impending doom, they could not stop. Perhaps it didn't want to. Caliph could feel it more clearly than ever now. The presence, the thing, the entity, it was close. So close. He wandered through the empty streets of the city. The lights of the towers flickered above him. Once, he had taken such pride in these cities, in their beauty, in their power. But now they just felt hollow. Empty. The streets were quiet. Too quiet. The Eldari had retreated into themselves, into their pleasures. The great palaces had become dens of hedonism. The once great culture of the Eldari had been reduced to a twisted, grotesque shadow of its former glory. And still, the darkness grew. Caliph found himself standing before the entrance to the hall. The great carved door was open, a faint, pulsing light spilling out onto the street. He could hear the sounds of the gathering already. He hesitated. He didn't want to go inside. Not this time. But he couldn't stay away. The pull was too strong. His hunger, was too overwhelming. With a sigh that was more like a shudder, he stepped inside. The hall was as it always was. Soft light, luxurious furnishings. But there was a tension in the room tonight. Something different. The others were already gathered, their minds already beginning to link. Navarra stood at the center, her back to him. He could feel her mind reaching out to his. But tonight there was something else there. Something cold. Something dark. Caliph, she said softly, without turning. You're just in time. He stepped forward, his movements slow. The psychic energy in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Something is coming, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Navarra smiled, turning to face him at last. Yes, she agreed, her eyes gleaming with something dangerous, something inhuman. It is. Caliph swallowed hard. And you're not afraid? Afraid? Navarra laughed softly, the sound sending a shiver down his spine. Why should I be afraid? We've been preparing for this for centuries, Caliph. It's what we've always wanted. To go beyond the limits of flesh, of mind, of the material world. To become something more. Caliph shook his head. This isn't right. Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. You don't understand, Caliph. Not yet, but you will. The presence you feel, the power, the God we've been touching, it's not just a part of us. It's what we've become. We've ascended beyond the old ways, beyond the old dead gods. And soon we will stand with the new. You could feel it now, more clearly than ever. The presence, the hunger, the storm that had been building in the warp. It was so close, so powerful, and it was pressing down on them, pressing into their very souls. And Navarra, she welcomed it. But Caliph wanted to run. He could feel the weight of it, the crushing psychic force of the storm bearing down on them. And he knew, with chilling certainty, it was too late. The darkness had already consumed them. The rituals, the pleasure, the emotions they had poured into the void, they had fed something far greater and far more terrible than themselves. And now, it was coming to claim them. The others had already begun the ritual, their minds merging, their emotions flowing together in a twisted, violent current of desire and fear and ecstasy and pain. Caliph felt it pull at him, pulling him deeper into the storm. He tried to resist. He tried to break free, but the pull was too strong. As the link solidified, he could feel the presence more clearly than ever. It was vast, monstrous, and it filled the space between their minds, weaving through their thoughts like a spider weaving its web. It was ancient, and it was hungry, so very, very hungry. The storm and the warp swelled around them. Caliph could feel the psychic energies tearing at his mind, tearing at his soul. The others were lost in it now, their faces twisted in masks of both ecstasy and agony, their bodies convulsing as the presence devoured them from within. Navarra stood at the center of it all, her arms raised high, her face serene. She was smiling, her eyes closed, her mind completely, utterly open to the storm. She had given herself to it, and now she was part of it. The presence roared through the link, and Caliph felt himself pulled under, dragged down into the depths of the storm. The currents of psychic energy crashed against him, tearing him apart piece by piece. And he could feel the presence, the god, sinking its claws into his soul, devouring him. But even as he fell, even as the darkness consumed him, he felt a part of him resist. It was small, barely a flicker, but it was there, a spark of something, something that still belonged to him. He clung to it. He clung to it with everything he had, holding on to that last, tiny piece of himself as the storm raged around him. The presence howled in fury, its hunger insatiable. Caliph felt it tear at him, trying to rip that last piece away. But he held on. Somehow he held on. When Caliph opened his eyes, the hall was silent. The storm had passed for a moment. The others lay scattered around the room, their bodies still, their minds shattered, their souls gone. Navarra stood in the center, her eyes glowing with a cold, unnatural purple light. The presence was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. It was not fully formed yet, but it was close. So very, very close. Caliph pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling. The storm in the warp was still building, and he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the end was coming. Slaanesh was almost here, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The skies over the Eldari home worlds were quiet, too quiet. A heavy, unnatural stillness hung in the air. The great, glittering towers that had once gleamed with light and life stood dark, casting long, foreboding shadows. Caliph felt it, deep in his bones, in his soul, the sense that something terrible was coming. But now, that presence was no longer distant. It was here. It had come for them. The storm that had been growing in the warp, the storm the Farseers had fled from, was no longer a distant threat. It had broken through. Its fury was ripping apart the very fabric of reality. Caliph could feel the pressure of it, suffocating. The air itself felt thick, charged with a dark, psychic energy. He stood on a balcony, overlooking the city. Everything felt wrong. The colors of the sky were muted, the light dimmer, as though the suns themselves were being swallowed by a vast, unseen shadow. Navarra had vanished after that last, terrible ritual. The connection between them had been severed, broken by the overwhelming force of the storm. Now, all that remained was the presence. The terrible, insatiable presence. Outside, the streets were eerily quiet. The few Eldari who remained walked in silence, their faces pale, their eyes distant. They felt it too. The whole empire was on edge. But still they carried on, as if nothing was wrong. Caliph stopped in the middle of the street, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He could feel it now, closer than ever. The presence. The thing that had been feeding off them for centuries. It was here. It was ready. And then it happened. The sky above the city split open. It happened not with a sound, but with a silence. A sudden, perfect, suffocating cessation of everything. And then, the scream. It was not a sound that entered the ears. It was a psychic detonation. It tore through the minds of every Eldari, a sound that was not heard but felt. Felt deep in the core of their beings. Felt in the very essence of their souls. Caliph staggered, his hands flying to his head as a wave of pure, psychic energy crashed over him. The force of it sent him to his knees. The air around him vibrated, the very fabric of reality warping and twisting as the storm broke through. And at the heart of the storm, Caliph felt it. Slaanesh, born in a single, violent, orgasmic moment of psychic ecstasy and horror. It was a scream of birth and a scream of death. a scream of infinite desire and infinite destruction. A sound so overwhelming, so vast, that it shattered minds, ripped apart bodies, and extinguished souls in an instant. Caliph cried out, clutching his head as the scream reverberated through him, threatening to tear him apart from the inside out. He could feel it, Slaanesh, reaching out, its dark psychic tendrils sinking into the minds of every Eldari, pulling them toward it, consuming them. The city was disintegrating. The buildings, once so proud and tall, crumbled as the storm of psychic energy tore through them. The ground cracked and split open, great chasms swallowing the streets, the towers, the people. The very air shimmered with the force of the warp, bleeding into real space, warping and distorting everything it touched. Eldari fell where they stood, their eyes wide with terror, their minds shattered. Caliph could hear their screams, both in the air and in his mind, echoing through the city. A chorus of agony and despair, as their souls were ripped from their bodies, consumed by the ravenous, newborn hunger of Slaanesh. He tried to stand, but his legs refused to obey. The force of the storm pressed him down, pinning him to the ground. He could feel his own soul slipping. He could feel Slaanesh's hunger, reaching for him, trying to devour him. But somehow, he resisted. He didn't know how. He didn't know why. But he clung to that last, tiny fragment of himself. That last, defiant piece of his soul that hadn't yet been consumed. He could feel the dark tendrils of Slaanesh wrapping around him, pulling at him. But he held on, refusing to let go. The storm raged on, tearing apart the city, tearing apart the world, tearing apart the empire. The warp had broken through. The boundary between real space and the immaterium was shattered. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The scream faded. The sky slowly, painfully, knit itself back together. The warp retreated, pulling back into the void. But the damage had been done. The city, no, the entire empire, was in ruins. What had once been a sprawling, vibrant, star-spanning civilization was now little more than ash and rubble, and the echoes of a trillion screams. The streets were littered with the bodies of Eldari, their eyes staring blankly at the sky, their souls gone, devoured by the god they had unknowingly birthed. Caliph lay in the middle of the street, his body trembling, his mind numb. The presence of Slaanesh still lingered in the air, faint but undeniable, a constant, low-thrumming reminder of the god's hunger. The birth of Slaanesh had torn a hole in the fabric of the universe. In the heart of what had once been the Eldari Empire, a gaping wound in reality now pulsed with dark, chaotic energy. The Eye of Terror, a permanent scar, left by the cataclysmic birth of the god of excess. And now, that wound would never heal. The Eldari were broken. Their empire was gone. All that remained were a few who had managed to survive, scattered across the stars, haunted by the knowledge that their own actions, their own excess, had brought about their own terrible doom. Caliph slowly, painfully pushed himself to his feet. The city around him was silent now. He looked up at the sky, his heart heavy. They had fallen. They had birthed a god, and in doing so, they had destroyed themselves. And Slaanesh, she who thirsts, would never, ever stop hungering. Part 7. The Fractured People. In the aftermath of Slaanesh's birth, the galaxy trembled. What had once been the heart of the Eldari Empire was now nothing. A wasteland of shattered planets, broken souls, and swirling, raw chaos. But far greater than the destruction of worlds was the rift that had torn open between the immaterium and real space. A wound in the fabric of the universe that would never, ever heal. The Cerastes male dictum. The Eye of Terror. Calithern stood at the edge of what had once been a world. Now it was a drifting, lifeless husk. The sky above him was a roiling, nauseating storm of unnatural colors and impossible shapes. The Eye of Terror dominated the horizon. A swirling, psychic vortex of pure, unadulterated warp energy. It was vast. It was terrible. It was the physical manifestation of the god's violent birth. It was the wound, the scar, left behind when the warp had torn through real space. Now, it loomed over the galaxy, a constant, terrifying reminder of the cataclysm. Caliph could feel the pull of the eye, the way it tugged at his soul, trying to draw him in. It was more than just a rift in space. It was a living thing, a gateway into the warp itself. And it was hungry. The warp had always been a dangerous place. But now, with the eye open, the warp was bleeding into the material world, its chaotic, cancerous influence spreading like a disease. The creatures that lurked within the warp, the demons, the monsters, the nightmares, now spilled into real space with terrifying ease. The Eye of Terror was a doorway through which chaos itself could now reach into the galaxy. And Slaanesh, the newborn god, was at the heart of it all. Caliph could still feel the presence of the god, distant but ever-present, a constant, gnawing pressure at the back of his mind. Slaanesh's hunger was insatiable, and Caliph knew, with a sickening certainty, that the god's thirst for Eldari souls would never be quenched. Even now, he could feel the faint pull of it, tugging at the edges of his consciousness. A reminder that no Eldari soul was safe. Not in life, and certainly not in death. The weight of it all pressed down on him. He sank to his knees, his hands gripping the cold, cracked ground. The once glorious empire of the Eldari was gone, and Caliph, he was one of the few who remained. A survivor. But for how long? What was the point of surviving if they were already doomed? The Eldari had brought this upon themselves. Their arrogance, their indulgence, their blindness had led them down this dark path. And now, there was no turning back. Slaanesh was awake. The Eye of Terror was open. The galaxy would never be the same again. Caliph. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the oppressive, silent desolation like a blade. Caliph looked up, his vision blurred with exhaustion and despair. Standing before him, shrouded in the flickering, unnatural light of the warp-torn sky, was Farser Melanos. Melanos, Caliph's voice cracked. Seeing him here now felt unreal, as though the Farser were a ghost, an echo of the world that had been. The eyes opened, Melanos said, his voice heavy with a sorrow that mirrored Caliph's own. It is as we feared. Caliph nodded weakly, his eyes drifting back to the swirling, monstrous vortex. It's worse than I imagined. It will only get worse, Melanos said. He stepped closer, his own gaze fixed on the eye. The galaxy is changing. Chaos has gained a foothold, and the warp will continue to spread. Slaanesh's birth has unleashed something we cannot control. Caliph looked up at him, a flicker of raw, sudden anger sparking in his chest. Then what's the point? Why do we survive if this is all that's left? Why do we flee to the craft worlds if we're just going to be hunted down by Slaanesh? Melanos was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he knelt beside Caliph. Because we are all that's left, he said quietly. Because we are the only hope for our people. Hope. Caliph's laugh was a bitter, broken sound. What hope is there in this? The Eye of Terror is open, Melanos. Slaanesh will never stop hunting us. The Eldari were finished. The Eldari as they were. Yes, Melanos agreed, his tone grave. But we are not the same Eldari we once were. We have seen what our excesses have wrought, and we will not make the same mistakes again. Caliph shook his head. It doesn't matter. We're already damned. Slaanesh will devour us all. Eventually. Melanos placed a hand on Caliph's shoulder, his grip firm. Not if we fight. Not if we resist. Resist. Caliph stared at him, incredulous. How? How do we resist a god? With wisdom, Melanos said, his voice steady. With discipline, we will not give in to the same temptations that destroyed us. The path forward, it is one of control, of focus. We must bind ourselves. We must walk the path, a rigid discipline that will shield our minds. If we allow ourselves to be consumed by emotion, by indulgence, Slaanesh will have us. But if we remain disciplined, if we control our desires, we can keep the Dark Prince at bay. Caliph wanted to believe him. He wanted desperately to believe that there was still hope. But the presence of the Eye of Terror loomed too large, too close. Ow! Caliph whispered. How can we live with this? With that, Melanos's expression hardened. We don't live with it. We fight it. Every day, with every breath. We fight the temptation to give in to the darkness, to the hunger. We protect our souls, Caliph, because that is all we have left. Caliph closed his eyes, his mind a whirl of emotion. We are the last of our kind. Melanos continued, his voice firm, insistent. We must protect what remains of the Eldari, even if it means living forever in the shadow of our greatest failure. The eye of terror flickered in the distance, its tendrils of chaotic energy reaching ever further into real space. A wound that would never heal. But as Caliph looked up at it, at the swirling, psychic maelstrom that had once been the heart of their empire, he felt something stir inside him. Perhaps it was hope. Perhaps it was defiance. Perhaps it was simply the desperate, primal need to survive. He didn't know. All he knew was that he wasn't ready to give in. Not just yet. We'll fight, Caliph said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it was firm. We'll fight. And with that, the remnants of the Eldari turned their backs on the Eye of Terror and prepared for the long, desperate, impossible struggle that lay ahead. The fall had left the Eldari shattered, not just in body, but in spirit. Their once unified empire was gone. What had once been the most advanced and powerful civilization in the galaxy was now a broken people. Scattered, divided, haunted by their past, and hunted by the god they had arrogantly created. Caliph walked the quiet, spiraling halls of his new home, the craft world Ulthwi. The faint, psychic hum of the Wraithbone structure vibrated through the soles of his feet. It was quiet here, too quiet. The craft worlds, once brimming with the life and purpose of the Exodus, now felt hollow, as though the very soul of the Eldari had been ripped away. The survivors moved like shadows through the halls, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes haunted by the memories of what they had lost. The craft worlds had been designed as sanctuaries, as arks. But now, they felt more like tombs. Silent, empty, filled with the ghosts of a once great people. The survivors were few. Most of the Eldari, billions, had been devoured by Slaanesh in the first, terrible moments of the god's birth. Their souls ripped from their bodies, consumed by the insatiable, screaming hunger of the Dark Prince. Those who had escaped, they had done so by luck or by foresight, fleeing aboard the craft worlds before the final cataclysm. But even those who had survived, they were not safe. Slaanesh's hunger was eternal, and every single Eldari soul was a prize to the god of excess. Even in death, they were not free. Caliph, he turned. Liran, the farser, stood there, her face pale, her expression weary. She, like so many others, bore the weight of survival, the crushing survivor's guilt. How are they? Caliph asked quietly. Liran sighed, struggling. The path helps, but it's hard. They're haunted, Caliph. We all are. The path. It was the discipline Melanos had spoken of. It was the only thing that kept them from falling into the same terrible excesses that had destroyed their empire. The Farsers had established it as a way to guide the survivors, to keep their powerful emotions in check. Each Eldari, each Asuryani, as they now call themselves, the children of Asurian, now followed a strict, rigid, all-consuming path. It was a way of life, a discipline that allowed them to focus their minds, to channel their intense emotions into constructive, safe pursuits. There was the path of the artisan, the path of the seer, the path of the dreamer, and, when necessity demanded, the path of the warrior. Upon this path, an Asuryani would don the armor and persona of a howling banshee, a striking scorpion, or a fire dragon, and become a living weapon, channeling their grief and rage into the art of war. But always, they remained on the path. To deviate, to allow their passions to run unchecked, was to invite the attention of she who thirsts. Without the path, they risked falling prey to the same temptations. Without the path, they risked damnation. Do you ever wonder if it was worth it? Liran asked, her dark eyes meeting his. Surviving, I mean? Caliph didn't answer right away. Was this survival? Was this life? They had escaped Slaanesh's immediate grasp, but they were still hunted, still cursed. Every single day was a struggle, not just to survive, but to keep their very souls intact. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice hollow. But the survivors were scattered, spread thin across the vast, hostile galaxy. Each craft world, Ulfwe, Bealtan, Siamhan, Inden, felt more isolated than the last. They had no empire, no home, just the cold, uncaring expanse of space. And then there were the others. Not all the Eldari had chosen the path of the craft worlds. Caliph had heard the dark, whispered rumors. Rumors of those who had fled, not into real space, but into the webway. The ancient, labyrinthine network of tunnels that crisscrossed the galaxy, hidden from the ravenous hunger of the warp. The Drukhari, they called themselves now. The Dark Eldar. They had chosen a different path. A path that rejected the discipline of the craft worlds. A path that embraced the very excesses that had led to their downfall. The Drukhari had found a way to survive, hidden in the dark, labyrinthine city of Kamarak, beyond the immediate reach of Slaanesh. But their survival, it came at a terrible price. They fed on the suffering of others. They had become parasites, vampires of pain. They drained the fear, the agony, the despair of their captives to sustain themselves, to replenish their own withered souls. It was a twisted, grotesque mockery of the Eldari's former glory. And then there were the Exodites, those who had fled long before the fall, those who had seen the rot, the decadence that had taken root in the heart of the Empire and had chosen to leave. They had abandoned the decadent ways of their civilization to live simple, agrarian lives on distant, unspoiled, maiden worlds. They had seen the danger, and they had left before it consumed them. Now, they lived in isolation, far from the influence of Slaanesh. But even they were not truly safe. No Eldari was safe. Not anymore. The remnants of the Eldari were scattered across the stars, each group clinging to a different hope, a different way of life. But none of them were free from the shadow of Slaanesh. Caliph turned away from the window, his heart heavy. The Asuryani, the Drukhari, the Exodites, they were all just fragments of a broken race. Remnants of a people who had once ruled the stars. And now they were nothing more than shadows, drifting through the void, trying to survive in a galaxy that no longer had a place for them. "But what else can we do?" he said quietly, more to himself than to Liran. "We carry on. We survive, because that's all we can do." Liran looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of profound sorrow and a glimmer of that old Eldari determination. "Yes," she agreed softly. "We survive." Part 8, The Dark City. As the Eldari Empire crumbled, as worlds burned, and as souls were consumed, screaming, by the newborn god Slaanesh. Not all who survived fled to the craft worlds. Not all chose the quiet, pastoral isolation of the Exodites. There were some who had seen the warnings and ignored them. Some who had witnessed the horror of the fall and had not flinched. These Eldari refused to abandon the decadent pleasures, the intoxicating sensations that had once defined their empire. They had tasted power, indulgence, and excess, and they craved more. Rather than turning away from the dark path that had destroyed their people, they embraced it. They perfected it. These were the Eldari who would become the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, the Webway, that vast, labyrinthine network of tunnels that wound through the immaterium, a separate dimension, shielded from the warp. It had been a refuge for the Eldari for millennia. But in the chaos of Slaanesh's birth, the Webway had become more than just a transportation system. It had become a sanctuary. The Drukhari had retreated into the deepest, darkest, most hidden depths of the Webway, hiding in the labyrinthine passages that stretched like a spider's web between stars. Here they found safety. Safety from the psychic scream of Slaanesh's birth. Safety from the cataclysm that had torn their empire apart. But the price of that safety was steep. In the heart of the Webway, the Drukhari built a city. It was not a city like those of the old empire, not a place of light and beauty and living wraithbone. This was a city born of darkness, of cruelty, of suffering. They named it Kamarak, the Dark City, It began as a gathering of survivors. Eldari, who had been part of the sensation cults, the cults of excess that had thrived in the final decadent days of the Empire. These cults had pushed the boundaries of sensation, and in doing so, they had fed the growing presence of Slaanesh. But now, in the aftermath of the fall, they had found a new purpose. Commorak was built on pain. It grew quickly, its twisted, dark spires, its impossible, jagged architecture, rising high in the dim, flickering, alien light of the webway. A monument to the Drukhari's dark, twisted ambitions. The Drukhari had learned, the hard way, that indulgence came with a price. Slaanesh had been born from their excess, and now the god hunted their souls. To escape that fate, to stave off the inevitable psychic pull of the Dark Prince's hunger, the Drukhari had found a new way to feed themselves. They fed on pain. In Commorak, the Drukhari learned that by inflicting suffering on others, by drawing out their pain, their fear, their agony, they could sustain themselves. They could slow the pull of Slaanesh's hunger. They could, in essence, use the agony of another living soul to top up their own dimming spirits, delaying the inevitable consumption by the god they had created. The more they inflicted, the more they could stave off the god's thirst. And so they did. They hunted. They tortured. They reveled in the agony of their victims, draining their life force, their very souls, to keep themselves alive. This was the birth of the Drukhari. They had become parasites, psychic vampires, feeding on the misery of others. Commorak grew. Its population swelled. As more survivors of the fall, those who could not, or would not, accept the sterile discipline of the craft worlds, made their way into the dark heart of the webway. Navara, once a high priestess of the pleasure cults, she was among the first to embrace this new, dark way of life. In the final days of the Empire, she had led the gatherings. She had pushed the limits of sensation. Her rituals had fed the presence of Slaanesh. Now, in the aftermath of the fall, she had become something darker, something far more dangerous. In Commorak, she found herself surrounded by like-minded souls. Eldari, who saw the fall, not as a punishment, but as an opportunity. Under Navara's leadership, the Drukhari cults flourished. The city became a place of endless indulgence, but it was an indulgence that came at the expense of others. The Drukhari, in their sleek, razor-winged ships, launched raids out of the webway into real space. They took captives from across the galaxy. Humans, orcs, Dol, even other Eldari. They brought them back to the dark heart of their city, where they were subjected to unspeakable, unimaginable tortures. Their suffering was drawn out, carefully, artfully orchestrated to maximize the pain, to wring every last, precious drop of fear and despair from their souls. The Drukhari didn't just revel in the suffering. They fed on it. In the darkest chambers of Commorak, in the homunculus' laboratories, the captive's agony was transformed into power, into sustenance. The more pain they inflicted, the more the Drukhari could feel themselves slipping free of Slaanesh's grasp, if only for a little while. But it was never enough. The hunger of Slaanesh was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting, and so they never stopped. The craft world Eldari, the Assyriani, had turned to discipline to rigid, iron control over their emotions. The Drukhari, they had chosen a different path, a path of indulgence, of excess, of cruelty. They had rejected the paths, choosing instead to embrace the very things that had brought about the fall. They inflicted pain, not just because it brought them pleasure, but because it kept them alive. For the Drukhari, survival was a delicate, desperate balance. They had to feed on the suffering of others, to stave off the gnawing hunger of Slaanesh. But they could never, ever truly escape it. And so they continued to feed, to torture, to drain the life force, the agony of their captives, knowing that the moment they stopped, the moment they let their guard down, Slaanesh would come for them. Commorak became a twisted, dark reflection of the old Eldari Empire, a city built on indulgence, but one that was sustained by suffering. The sounds of the city were not the sounds of music and and laughter. They were the sounds of screams, of pain, of the endless, unimaginable torment that sustained the Drukhari. But for all its darkness, for all its cruelty, Commerack was a place of survival. The Drukhari had found a way to live, to escape the fate that had claimed so many of their kin. They had rejected the paths of the craft worlds. They had rejected the quiet isolation of the Exodites, and had, instead, embraced the darkness. They had chosen a path of pain and suffering. But in that suffering, they had found a way to survive. And as long as they could feed on the agony of others, they would continue to live, defying Slaanish's hunger, for as long as they could, because to stop was to die. And for the Drukhari, there was nothing worse than death. Part 9, The Maiden Worlds. Long before the fall, long before the first whispers of excess began to ripple through Eldari society, a few had already seen the danger. These Eldari were visionaries, practical, clear-eyed souls who recognized that their glittering, perfect empire was walking a dark, dangerous path. They looked around at the spiraling, unchecked decadence, the hollow pleasures, and they knew, with a deep, abiding certainty, that something was fundamentally wrong. These Eldari, they chose a different path, a path of retreat, of self-exile. They forsook the glittering, impossible cities. They forsook the star-spanning empire and the intoxicating, easy allure of endless luxury. They sought, instead, a simpler life, away from the corruption and the rot they saw spreading, like a cancer, through the heart of their people. These were the Exodites. Their new homes were not the vibrant, perfect, crafted paradises of the Eldari Empire. They were untamed, wild, often hostile. To most Eldari, these maiden worlds would have been seen as primitive. But to the Exodites, they were sanctuaries. These worlds offered the purity that had been lost in the heart of their civilization. The purity of nature, of struggle, of balance. The Exodites carved out new lives on these wild, untamed worlds, learning to live in harmony with the natural order. They abandoned the sophisticated, living technology and the psychic, effortless luxuries of their former lives, choosing, instead, to live by simpler, more honest means. It was not an easy life. They worked the land with their own hands. They built their homes from the raw, natural materials of their new worlds. They fought off the dangers, the great, primal beasts that lurked in the wilderness. But it was a life that gave them something they had lost in the heart of the Empire. Purpose. Kayla Thurn had never understood the Exodites. He had seen them as outcasts, as reactionaries, those who had rejected the undeniable gifts of Eldari progress in favor of a backward, primitive, squalid existence. He recalled with a hot flush of shame, he had even laughed at their departure, thinking them fools for turning away from the perfection their race had achieved. But now, standing on the rich, dark soil of an Exodite world, Caliph could only envy them. The air here was fresh, clean, untouched by the psychic pollutants and the warp-touched, chaotic energies that had, in the end, torn the Eldari home worlds apart. The forests were alive with sound. This was a world of life, a place where the Exodites had forged a future, far from the madness that had consumed the rest of their race. Caliph watched as a group of Exodites passed by. Their clothing was simple, made from woven fibers and cured hides. Their faces were calm, serene. They carried tools and weapons, not the sleek, elegant artifacts of the old empire, but hand-forged, practical, sturdy instruments, designed for survival. These Eldari, they were not the aloof, decadent, fragile aristocrats he had once known. They were strong, weathered by hard labor and the demands of the land. They had found a way to survive, not by bending the world to their will, but by learning to live within its limits. In the heart of the Empire, the Eldari had shaped reality itself to suit their desires. They had bent the warp to their will. They had grown arrogant, thinking themselves gods, untouchable. The Exodites, they had seen this arrogance for what it was. They had seen the danger long before the fall, and they had acted. leaving behind the false, hollow paradise of their empire to forge a new, real life on the frontier. And now, in the aftermath of the cataclysm, it was the Exodites who had survived, who had escaped the birth of Slaanesh and the psychic destruction of their people. But their survival, it had come at a cost. The Exodites had chosen to live far from the protection of the webway. Their new worlds were isolated, distant from a new, fledgling heart of the craft worlds. And as a result, they were vulnerable. The dangers of the universe were many. Raiders, orcs, xenos, and even chaos could threaten their new way of life. And without the advanced, godlike technology of the old empire, the Exodites had to rely on their own newfound strength to defend themselves. They had become warriors, in a way the Eldari of the old empire had never been. They fought not for conquest, not for power, but for survival. The Exodites had developed a deep, profound, psychic connection to their new worlds. They saw themselves not as rulers of the land, but as its guardians. They had bonded with their worlds, connecting to the world spirit, a nascent collective consciousness similar to the infinity circuits of the craft worlds, but natural, born of the planet itself. They fought alongside the great, primal beasts that roamed their planets, creatures they had learned to tame and to bond with. These dragons, as they were sometimes called, they were massive, armored, reptilian beasts that the Exodites used as living weapons, riding them into battle against any who threatened their way of life. Here, on these distant, primitive worlds, the Exodites had found a way to live, in harmony with the universe, a way to survive without falling into the same terrible traps that had led to the fall. But even here, on these quiet, distant, maiden worlds, the shadow of Slaanesh loomed. The Exodites, they may have escaped the immediate physical destruction of the fall, but they had not escaped the curse that now hung over all Eldari. Slaanesh's hunger was eternal, and no Eldari soul was safe from its grasp. The Exodites knew this, and they had taken steps to protect themselves. Like their craft world kin, the Exodites used spirit stones to trap their souls upon death, preventing them, hopefully, from being devoured by Slaanesh. These stones, carefully crafted and blessed by their own world spirit, were worn at all times, a constant, heavy reminder of the danger that lurked always in the warp. But the Exodites, they did not live in fear. They had accepted their fate, accepted that they would always be hunted by the god of excess. But they refused to let that knowledge define their lives. They lived with purpose, with a quiet strength that came from their connection to the land, to their worlds, to each other. They had built something lasting, something real. In a way, Caliph envied them. They had found a peace that he doubted he would ever know. The Exodites had found their place in the galaxy, and now it was time for him to find his. Part 10, The Age of Enduring. Calithern stood on the edge of the craft world's observation deck, staring out into the cold, unfeeling void. The stars glittered distantly, cold, remote. Beyond them, hidden in the dark, psychic expanse, lay the Eye of Terror, pulsing, always pulsing, a gaping wound in reality, the scar left by the birth of Slaanesh. It was the legacy of the Eldari, the greatest sin of their once glorious empire, and it would haunt them for all eternity. For uncounted centuries, the Eldari had been a race of gods, masters of the galaxy, but they had not been content. They had hungered for more pleasure, more sensation, more ecstasy, and in their blind, arrogant pursuit of excess, they had sown the seeds of their own terrible destruction. The birth of Slaanesh had been the culmination of their arrogance, their blindness, and now the galaxy paid the price. The remnants of the Eldari were scattered across the stars, a broken, dying race, forever hunted by the god they had unleashed upon the universe. The craft worlds drifted through space, their inhabitants bound by the rigid, iron-willed paths, disciplines that kept their powerful emotions, their dangerous desires, in check. The Exodites lived quietly on their distant maiden worlds, far from the chaos and temptation of the galaxy. The Drukhari hid in the dark, labyrinthine depths of the webway, feeding on pain, on suffering, to stave off Slaanish's eternal hunger. But no matter where they went, no matter how far they fled, Slaanish's shadow loomed over them all. Every single Eldari soul was a prize to the Dark Prince. In the end, death was not an escape. It was only the beginning of an eternal torment in the clutches of she who thirsts. Caliph had felt the presence of Slaanish in the warp every single day since the fall. It was a constant pressure, a gnawing hunger at the edge of his mind. Always there, always waiting. Every Eldari felt it. It was the reason they followed the paths. The reason they kept their emotions so tightly, so painfully controlled. To let their guard down, even for a moment, was to risk falling into the abyss. He took a deep breath, his hand tightening around the spirit stone that hung around his neck. The smooth, crystalline surface pulsed faintly with psychic energy. A reminder that even in death, the Eldari were not free. The spirit stone, it was their only defense, their only chance at escaping the clutches of Slaanish. When an Eldari died, their soul was drawn into the stone, trapped in its psychic matrix, safe from the gods' ravenous hunger. But even then, they were not truly free. Their souls, their spirit stones, would be placed into the infinity circuit, an artificial afterlife housed within the wraithbone heart of the craft world, where they would exist in a state of eternal limbo, their minds, their memories, contributing to the collective psychic consciousness of the craft world. It was a cruel fate, Caliph thought, but it was better than the alternative. The paths gave them structure, purpose, discipline, but they could not erase the guilt, the shame that hung over them all. The Eldari had once been proud, arrogant, confident in their vast superiority over all other races. Now they were a shadow of their former selves, clinging desperately to survival in a galaxy that no longer belonged to them. We're a doomed race, Caliph murmured to himself, the words heavy with resignation. Perhaps, a voice said from behind him, but we are not yet finished. Caliph turned. Farser Melanos was approaching, his ancient, wise eyes meeting Caliph's. We survived, Melanos continued, stepping up beside Caliph to gaze out at the stars. That alone is something. Caliph shook his head. Surviving isn't enough. Where are we now? What are we fighting for? Our empire is gone. Our people are broken. We've lost everything. Not everything, Melanos said quietly. We still have our souls. As long as we have that, there's hope. Hope. Caliph's laugh was bitter. Hollow. Hope for what? Even if we survive 1,000 more years, Slaanish will still be waiting for us at the end. Melanos nodded slowly, his gaze distant. It's true. We cannot escape Slaanish forever. The Dark Prince will hunt us until the end of time. But we are not the same Eldari who once ruled the stars. He turned, his ancient, wise eyes meeting Caliph's. We have learned, Caliph. We have learned from our mistakes, and we will not repeat them. That is what we fight for now. Not to rebuild what we lost, but to preserve what we have. To ensure that our people, though doomed, do not fade away into oblivion. Caliph stared at the Farser. He wanted to argue, to rail against the futility of it all. But he couldn't. There was truth in what Melanos said. They had survived, when so many billions others had not. They had found a way to protect their souls, to resist the lure of Slaanish's hunger, even if only for a time. And in that there was something worth preserving. But how long? Caliph asked, his voice soft. How long can we last? How long can we keep running from Slaanish? As long as we need to, Melanos replied, his voice hardening with resolve. We are Eldari. We have lived for millennia, and we will continue to live for millennia more. Slaanish may be patient, but so are we. We have our paths, our craft worlds, our spirit stones. We will endure. Endure. It wasn't the future Caliph had once imagined for his people. It wasn't the future any of them had imagined, but it was the only future they had left. The age of the Eldari Empire was over, and what remained of their race was scattered, divided, broken, but they were still here, still fighting, still surviving. Caliph turned back to the stars, his hands still resting on his spirit stone. The cold void stretched out before him. Flushed, indifferent, but it no longer filled him with despair. He had seen what the Exodites had built, had felt the strength of the craft worlds, had witnessed the resilience of his people in the face of overwhelming odds. They were a doomed race, yes, but they were not yet defeated. "We will endure," Caliph said quietly, his voice resolute. "For as long as we can." Melanos smiled, faintly, his ancient eyes still fixed on the distant stars. "Yes," he said, "we will." And as they stood together on the edge of the craft world, the remnants of a fallen empire, the shadow of Slaanish loomed over them, a constant, terrible reminder of their doom. But they were Eldari. They had survived the birth of a god, the destruction of their empire, and the scattering of their people. They would endure, even in the face of death itself, because they had no other choice.